The familiar hum of my old sedan quieted as I pulled into the driveway, gravel crunching beneath the tires. Eric and Amanda's house stood proudly in the middle of their pristine neighborhood. Tidy lawns, perfectly trimmed hedges, and not a leaf out of place. The kind of place that felt more like a showcase than a home. I straightened my cardigan, smoothing out invisible creases before picking up the ceramic casserole dish from the passenger seat. My hands ran along its smooth edges, blue flowers, etched around the rim, my grandmother's work. It had been a staple at every family gathering for generations, filled with roasted vegetables, baked macaroni, or Amanda's favorite, sweet potato casserole. I knocked twice, out of habit, even though I knew I was welcome, or at least I used to be. Amanda opened the door, her smile tight and quick. "Hi, Grace," she greeted, stepping aside. The twins barreled past her, giggling and chasing each other, their laughter echoing down the hall. I tried to catch their eyes, but they darted around the corner before I could say hello. "Good to see you too," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. Amanda didn't respond, already disappearing into the kitchen. I followed, my footsteps cautious, the warmth of past Sunday dinners feeling distant, almost unfamiliar. The dining room was immaculately set, white linen, polished silverware, and floral centerpieces. I placed the casserole dish on the counter and glanced around. "Where's Eric?" I asked, untying my scarf. "Upstairs with the kids." "He'll be down soon," Amanda replied, barely looking up from her chopping board. Her movements were precise, methodical. I watched her slice carrots, each one exactly the same width, falling into neat rows. I was hoping to borrow back the casserole, dish I lent you for that work event, I said gently, leaning against the counter. "I need it for church tomorrow." Amanda's hand paused, just slightly. "The dish?" "Yes, my grandmother's. Blue flowers around the edge. You borrowed it a few months ago." She straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. "Oh, I still have it somewhere," she said, her voice clipped. "I'll find it eventually." I tried to keep my tone light. "The potluck is tomorrow, and Pastor Miller specifically requested my sweet potato casserole. If you could—" Amanda's sigh cut through my words, sharp and loud. "I'm in the middle of prepping dinner, Grace. I can't drop everything to dig through cabinets for an old dish right now." Her voice carried that edge I'd grown accustomed to over the past few years. Subtle at first, like the shift of a breeze, but lately, it had sharpened, becoming less patient, more pointed. "I understand you're busy, dear. Maybe I could just take a quick peek? I'm sure I can find it." Amanda slammed the knife down, her knuckles white against the countertop. "This," she gestured around the kitchen, her eyes locked on mine. "This is exactly the problem. You're always keeping tabs, counting what you've loaned, tracking what we owe you." I blinked, stunned by the sudden shift. "It's just a casserole dish." "It's never just a casserole dish with you," she snapped. "It's comments about how the twins need haircuts, how they should be in piano lessons, how the pantry would be so much more efficient if it were organized differently." I felt my cheeks flush, heat crawling up my neck. "I only want to help. We don't need your help," she spat, her voice rising. "We need space, real space, not just you dropping by unannounced or rearranging our house when you think we're not looking." My hands gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles pale against the white granite. "I only visit once a week," I whispered. I thought I was respecting your boundaries. Her laughter was sharp, hollow. "Respecting our boundaries? Last Christmas, you bought the twins that tablet after we specifically told you we were getting it for them. You never ask, Grace. You just decide you know better." The front door creaked, and Eric walked in, his briefcase dangling from his hand, his tie slightly loosened. He stopped, glancing between us. "What's going on?" "Your mother is upset about a casserole dish," Amanda said, crossing her arms over her chest. It's not about the dish, I protested, my voice trembling. Amanda is saying I'm suffocating you all, that I'm undermining you as parents. I looked to Eric, my son, my only child. The boy I raised after his father died. The boy I sacrificed, worked 2 jobs for, postponed dreams for. I searched his face for understanding, for the peacemaker I knew him to be. Instead, he sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so much like his father's, it made my heart ache. Mom, he began, his voice gentle but firm. We've been meaning to talk to you about this. My breath caught. About what? His eyes met Amanda's, and she nodded, her gaze steely. About you. Overstepping, he finished. I stared at him, disbelief clawing its way up my throat. Overstepping? It's just, sometimes it feels like you're not respecting the life we're trying to build, he said, his eyes falling to the floor. My grip tightened on the counter until my fingers ached. I thought I was helping, I whispered. We don't need your help, Amanda repeated, her voice unyielding. Not the way you give it. Not with the strings attached. There are no strings, I said, my voice cracking. Just love. Just family. Amanda crossed her arms tighter, her eyes flaring. We'd be better off without you, she snapped. I flinched, like she'd struck me, the words slapping across my face. My gaze flicked to Eric, waiting for him to deny it, to take it back. He didn't. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, and his silence told me everything. The room grew colder, the air heavier, my hands unclenched, falling to my sides. Without a word, I grabbed my purse, the weight of years and sacrifice heavy on my shoulders, and I walked out the door. The screen door snapped shut behind me. And just like that, I disappeared. The drive back to Maple Grove blurred into a haze of streetlights and distant headlights, each flicker smearing against the windshield like distant stars. My hands clenched the steering wheel, knuckles pale and stiff. Amanda's words echoed in my head, sharp and unyielding. We'd be better off without you. I hadn't responded. I'd simply left, the sound of the screen door snapping shut behind me still ringing in my ears. I glanced at the empty passenger seat where the casserole dish had sat, its absence stark and unforgiving. It was just a dish, but it wasn't, was it? It was legacy. It was tradition. It was belonging. Maple Grove street lamps flickered too, life as I pulled onto the familiar cobblestone road. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of peaceful that only comes with age, like the trees that lined the street, their roots gripping deep beneath the surface, steady and unmoving. My Victorian house waited at the end of the block, its gabled roof and stained glass windows shimmering under the soft glow of the porch light I'd left on. A beacon, always welcoming, always waiting. I parked in the driveway and killed the engine, but I didn't move. I just sat there, the silence pressing in, heavier than I remembered. My hands rested in my lap, the chill of Amanda's words still clinging to my skin. We don't need your help, not the way you give it. With a sigh, I opened the door, the cool night air rushing to meet me. It was sharp, biting, almost cleansing. Gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I walked up the steps, pausing for a moment on the porch. My fingers brushed. The weathered railing, the one Eric used to lean against as a boy, waiting for the school bus with his backpack too big for his little shoulders. I could still hear his voice sometimes, his laughter bouncing off the walls, filling the house with a kind of warmth I hadn't realized I'd been living without. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of lemon polish and aged wood wrapping around me like an old quilt. I closed the door gently behind me, the lock clicking into place, sealing me in, alone. Again. The hallway stretched before me, lined with photographs. Eric as a baby, wrapped in that blue blanket my mother had knitted. His first steps on the front lawn, tiny feet kicking up dandelions. His graduation, his arms slung around me, both of us beaming. Our eyes shared the same crinkle at the edges, the same spark of pride. I reached out and traced the edge of the frame, my fingers brushing against the glass. My gaze drifted to the other pictures, family gatherings in this very house. Christmas. Mornings with wrapping paper scattered across the living room floor. Easter dinners where we'd squeeze around the long oak table, laughing and sharing stories. The house had been alive then, bursting with life and laughter. Now, it was just me and the memories pressed between four walls. I moved through the rooms, touching the back of the sofa where Eric and I had spent countless evenings watching black and white movies. The mantel where I'd hung our stockings every Christmas. Eve, his always a little fuller than mine. I remembered the first Christmas after his father died. Eric had only been 12. He'd tried to fill my stocking himself, slipping in a handful of peppermints and a note that simply read, "For Mom. I love you." I kept that note, tucked away in the drawer of my nightstand. Sometimes, when the nights grew long and silent, I would take it out and hold it in my hands, letting the paper grow soft and worn beneath my fingertips. But that was before Amanda. Before things changed. I walked into the kitchen, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The linoleum still held the marks of Eric's first tricycle, scuffed and scraped but never replaced. Amanda had commented on it once, shortly after they married. "Maybe it's time to renovate," she'd suggested, her eyes scanning the cabinets, the countertops, the floor. I'd smiled and nodded but never touched a thing. That's when the subtle changes began. Comments about the food I'd bring for Sunday dinners. "We're trying to eat healthier, Grace. Maybe something lighter next time?" Her eyes would scan the living room when they visited, noting the stacks of magazines or the slightly crooked painting over the fireplace. She rearranged my spice rack once without asking. I hadn't said anything, but I'd put it back the moment they left. I shook the memory away and stepped into the dining room. The long oak table stretched before me, its surface polished and gleaming. I ran my hand over it, remembering the birthdays, the celebrations, the times Eric would sit with his homework spread out, brow furrowed in concentration. His first science project had been built right there, on that very surface. "A volcano," I whispered, smiling despite myself. It exploded too soon, but those days were gone. Faded photographs in dusty frames. My hand dropped to my side, the weight of it all pulling me down. I stood there for a long while, listening to the silence, letting it sink in. When I finally moved, it was to the front window. I parted the curtains just slightly, peering out into the empty street. Lights glowed warmly. From neighbors' windows, soft and inviting, I could almost hear the distant clatter of dishes, the murmur of conversation, the crackle of a fireplace. Homes filled with life, with family. Mine was just a house now, a place I occupied, a collection of things that once held meaning. I released the curtain, the fabric slipping back into place. It wasn't the same anymore. It hadn't been for years. Not since Amanda. Not since the walls of my life had slowly closed in, squeezing out space for me. I walked back to the hallway, pausing by the photograph of Eric and me on his graduation day. My fingers grazed his face, the young man with the hopeful eyes. He had needed me once. Now I was just extra. That night, as I climbed into bed, the sheets cool and crisp against my skin, I stared at the ceiling, wide-eyed and awake. My mind replayed Amanda's words over and over again until they bled into my thoughts. "We'd be better off without you." I swallowed the ache in my throat, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. Maybe they would. Maybe she was. Right. And maybe, just maybe, it was time I disappeared. The bell above Mr. Harmon's office door chimed as I stepped inside, the familiar scent of leather and lemon polish wrapping around me like an old friend. His office hadn't changed in 20 years. Same mahogany desk, same dusty law books stacked neatly on shelves, same clock ticking rhythmically above his chair. He looked up as I entered, adjusting his glasses and offering that warm, familiar smile. "Grace?" he said, standing and extending his hand. "Always a pleasure. How's Eric? And the grandkids?" "Doing well," I replied politely, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. I took a seat across from him, smoothing my skirt over my knees. "I need to talk to you about my will." Mr. Harmon raised an eyebrow, his smile faltering just slightly. "Your will? Are you planning a trip I don't know about?" I chuckled, shaking my head. "No trips, just, I'm thinking of making some changes." He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "All right, let's hear it." My gaze drifted to the framed photographs on his desk, smiling family portraits, grandkids in matching sweaters, beach vacations frozen in time. I wondered if his children still called him just to talk, or if they only reached out when they needed something. I swallowed hard and straightened my shoulders. I want to sell the house. The silence was palpable, stretching between us like a taut string. Mr. Harmon's expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief. "The house on Maple Grove? You're Victorian?" "Grace, you've always said you wanted to keep that in the family, for Eric and the children." I nodded, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "I know what I said, but things change." He leaned forward, his eyes studying my face. "What kind of change are we talking about?" I looked him in the eye, my voice steady. "I'm done living for other people's expectations. I'm tired of being a footnote in my own story. It's time I did something for myself." He removed his glasses, wiping the lenses with a cloth he pulled from his pocket. "Grace, forgive me for asking, but is everything all right? This seems sudden." I hesitated, my fingers brushing over the stitching on my handbag. How much should I say? How much did he need to know? "Eric and Amanda, they've made it clear that I'm a burden," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been holding on to that house for them, but it's not theirs. It's mine, and I think it's time I did something with it." Mr. Harmon studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "If you're sure, I can make the arrangements. But I have to ask, are you doing this out of spite?" The question stung, but I shook my head. "Not spite. Clarity. I've been waiting for someone else's life to begin before I start living mine. That's not fair. Not to them, and certainly not to me." His gaze softened, and he slipped his glasses back on. "All right, Grace. I'll start the paperwork. We'll find you a good agent. But I want you to take the weekend to think about it. I mean, really think about it. Once the ball starts rolling, it's not easy to stop." I nodded, even though I knew there was nothing left to think about. I'd been thinking about it for years. 2 weeks later, a bold red for sale sign stood rooted in my front yard, its sharp edges slicing through the manicured lawn. Neighbors stopped by, their voices hushed and full of questions. I answered politely, explaining that I was looking for something smaller, something easier to manage. None of them understood, not really. But then again, they hadn't heard the words Amanda had spoken. The real estate agent, a bright-eyed woman named Linda, assured me the house would sell quickly. "Victorians like this don't last long on the market," she said confidently, "especially in Maple Grove." It didn't. Within days, offers poured in, couples wanting to restore its grandeur, families eager to fill its rooms with new memories. But one offer stood out, cash, no contingencies, and a promise to close within the month. I asked Linda who it was. She told me it was a developer, someone who planned to tear it down and build something modern. Are you sure you want to accept this one? She asked, her voice careful. They won't preserve it. This place would be gone. I looked around at the house, my hand resting on the banister I'd polished for years, the wallpaper Eric and I had picked out after his father died, the creaky floorboard in the hallway that always groaned goodnight when I tucked him in. And yet it all felt like echoes now, whispers of a life that had moved on without me. Yes, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. I'm sure. The days blurred together after that. The realtor moved quickly, the papers were signed, and just like that, the house on Maple Grove wasn't mine anymore. I walked through each room with cardboard boxes and old linens, wrapping up the life I had built. My hands brushed over the dining room table where Eric had done his homework, the mantel where stockings had hung for 37 Christmases, the porch swing where I had rocked him to sleep during warm summer nights. I packed photograph albums and knickknacks, leaving behind what was no longer mine to keep. I set aside heirlooms for Eric and the twins, his father's watch, the silver candlesticks from my wedding, the knitted blanket my mother had made when Eric was born. The rest I donated. China sets I hadn't touched in years, lamps that still worked but had grown dull with age, the old armchair that Eric's father had favored. It all went to charity, boxed and labeled, sent off to start again in someone else's story. When Amanda found out, her voice shook with disbelief. You're selling the house? That's our legacy. The children's inheritance. I had only smiled, even though her words stung. No, Amanda, I corrected gently. It was mine. You're being ridiculous, she spat. Petty and reactionary. You can't just throw away history because you're mad. I'm not throwing away history, I replied. I'm letting go of something that's held me back for too long. Her eyes narrowed, her voice low. You'll regret this. Maybe, I said, meeting her gaze without flinching. But I think I'd regret staying even more. The morning the movers came, I stood on the porch, my hand resting on the wooden frame. I whispered my goodbyes, not to the house, but to the woman I had been inside its walls. Then I got into my car, watching the Victorian shrink in my rear view, mirror until it disappeared entirely. My new condo awaited me in Seaside Heights, bright and airy, overlooking the ocean. It smelled of salt water and new beginnings. When I stepped inside, the sound of waves crashing against the shore greeted me, soft and rhythmic. I dropped my keys on the counter, took a deep breath, and smiled. I had finally let go. The first morning, in my new condo, I woke to the sound of waves brushing against the shore. It wasn't the gentle tick of the grandfather clock, or the groan of old wood settling, but the steady rhythm of the ocean. I pulled back the curtains, and sunlight spilled into the room, stretching across the floorboards like liquid gold. Outside, the horizon stretched wide and unbroken, the sky a crisp blue that seemed endless. I stepped onto the balcony, still in my robe, coffee cup warming my hands. Below, the boardwalk was beginning to wake. Joggers pacing their steps, couples walking hand in hand, the occasional cyclist weaving through the crowd. The salty air filled my lungs, brisk and clean, chasing away the mustiness of all those years spent in the Victorian. For the first time in a long while, I felt unburdened. No list of chores waiting, no casseroles to bake or floors to mop. Just the ocean and me, stretching out in either direction, endless and unapologetic. I adjusted quickly to life by the D. Mornings were spent walking the boardwalk, my pace unhurried, the wind tugging strands of hair from my bun. I found a little cafe that served the most wonderful pastries, and I'd sit by the window, watching life bustle by as I sipped my coffee. I even joined a book club at the local library, the members, mostly women my age, warmly welcoming me into their circle. They invited me to a pottery class one Wednesday evening, and though I hesitated, I found myself sitting before a spinning wheel, hands slick with wet clay. It was messy, imperfect, but it was mine. I created misshapen bowls, uneven mugs, but each one felt like a tiny victory. Linda from the real estate office had been right. The condo was perfect. Bright and airy, it caught the sunlight just right in the mornings and cooled with the ocean. Breeze in the afternoons. I hung photographs of my travels. Places I'd visited before life got complicated, before my world shrank to Sunday dinners and whispered resentments. I sent postcards to the twins, carefully writing each one. Bright pictures of the boardwalk, sunsets over the water, even one of the pottery studio. I wrote about my classes, the friends I was making, the dolphins I'd seen on my morning walks. I imagined their faces lighting up when they saw my handwriting, asking Amanda to read them aloud. I imagined her hesitation, the pause before she obliged. But the silence stretched on. No calls, no texts, no photos of the twins or updates from Eric. The postcards continued to go out every week. The silence continued to stretch. The flyer had been tacked onto the corkboard at the community center. Alaskan cruise, 10 days of glaciers and northern lights. I stood there for a long moment, reading the bold letters, tracing my finger over the glossy photo of a ship cutting through icy waters. A woman beside me, bundled in a bright red scarf, smiled as she saw me linger. "You should go," she said, her eyes crinkling with kindness. "I did last year. It's breathtaking." I thanked her politely, but her words stayed with me. It felt impossible, traveling, alone. I had never even gone to the grocery store without calling Eric to see if he needed anything. But then I thought of my mornings on the boardwalk, the pottery classes, the way I felt walking barefoot in the sand. When I booked the ticket, I felt a thrill ripple through me. Something I hadn't felt since I was young. Maybe ever. The cruise. Ship loomed large and white against the gray Seattle sky. I stood on the dock, my suitcase trembling slightly in my grip. I watched families gather, friends chatting excitedly, couples holding hands. For a moment, doubt crept in. What was I doing here, alone and so far from home? But then the wind shifted, carrying the smell of salt water and pine, and I stepped forward. My cabin was cozy, with a small porthole that framed the ocean like a moving painting. The first few days passed in a blur of exploration. Glittering. Ice fields, towering glaciers, and whale sightings that left me breathless. I ate dinners alone in the dining room, watched sunsets from the deck, and attended lectures about the northern wildlife. It was on the third day that I met Elaine. She joined me at breakfast, plopping her tray down and smiling as if we were old friends. "Mind if I join you?" "I hate eating alone," she said with a grin. Elaine was a widow, like me, but with a fire in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. She was bold and loud, her laughter carrying across the dining hall. We spent the rest of the cruise together, watching glaciers calve into the sea, hiking along the rugged coastline, even braving the chilly waters for a quick splash. One evening, as we stood on the upper deck, bundled in thick scarves and woolen hats, the sky erupted in color. Greens and purples swirled across the horizon, shimmering and dancing like ribbons in the wind. The northern lights. I blinked back tears, my breath clouding in front of me. Elaine squeezed my arm, her voice soft. "This is living, Grace," she whispered. "Don't you forget it." I didn't. When the ship docked back in Seattle, I hugged Elaine goodbye and promised to stay in touch. We swapped addresses, her handwriting scrawled across the back of a receipt I tucked safely into my coat pocket. She promised to visit Seaside, Heights in the summer. I promised to join her in Maine for the fall. I returned to my condo with a newfound sense of purpose. The air felt lighter, the mornings brighter. I walked the boardwalk with a little more spring in my step, joined a painting class at the community center, and signed up for beach yoga, something I never would have imagined doing before. The postcards kept going out every week, the silence kept stretching on, and I kept living. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sun sink into the horizon, my phone buzzed. My heart leapt, but when I glanced at the screen, it was a spam call. My hands dropped back into my lap, the glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across my living room. They hadn't called. Not once. Not a single text or a picture of the twins. But for the first time, the ache didn't burn quite so sharp. I sipped my tea, letting the warmth spread through me, and watched the ocean stretch out far and wide, no longer feeling like it was swallowing me whole. I was learning to float. It was a Thursday afternoon when my phone buzzed for the first time in weeks. I was sitting on my balcony, a soft breeze rolling in off the ocean, flipping through a travel magazine with pictures of Paris, Rome, and the Greek Isles. I set my cup of chamomile tea down and glanced at the screen. Missed call, Eric. I stared at it, the screen lighting up and fading out, like a heartbeat pulsing in my hand. It rang again. Eric. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. My breath caught in my throat, my fingers gripping the edge of the phone. Moments later, another call. This time, Amanda. I ignored it. The calls came again. Eric, then Amanda, then Eric again. I watched as the notifications piled up, my hands stilling on the pages of the magazine. For the first time in weeks, I felt the flutter of anxiety in my chest, the old habit of worry stirring to life. But I pushed it down. Whatever it was, it could wait. I was busy. By Friday morning, I had 21 missed calls. 8 from Eric, 6 from Amanda, and the rest from numbers I didn't recognize. My voicemail was full, but I didn't listen to a single one. If it was important, they'd try again. I took my morning walk along the boardwalk, nodding at familiar faces and stopping at the cafe that had become my regular haunt. I sipped my coffee, savoring the view of the ocean stretching wide and unburdened. It wasn't until I got home and checked the mail that I found a handwritten note slipped into my mailbox. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. Mom, please. We need to talk. Call me. Eric. I read it twice, then set it on the counter. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the condo pressing in around me. Finally, I picked up my phone and dialed. He answered on the first ring. Mom? His voice was tight, barely contained. What have you done? I blinked. I'm not sure what you mean, Eric. The house, he snapped. Mrs. Henderson called me. There's a construction crew there. They're demolishing it. You sold it? Without telling us? I waited a beat, letting the tension unravel in his silence. Yes, I said calmly. I sold it. There was a pause. Then his voice rose, sharp and accusing. How could you do that? That was our inheritance, the kids' college fund. You can't just do that, Mom. My grip on the phone tightened, but my voice remained steady. I can, Eric. It was my house. And I did. You didn't even discuss it with us, he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. I thought you were just being dramatic when you moved. I didn't think you'd actually... How could you just throw away our family home like that? I took a breath, holding my ground. I didn't throw it away. I sold it. And I've set up college funds for the twins. They're taken care of. More than taken care of, actually. Silence hung heavy between us, sharp and raw. Finally, Eric whispered, You really did it. You really sold it. Yes, I replied, my voice softening. I did. There was a shuffle on the other end, and suddenly Amanda's voice filled the line, clipped and furious. "So that's it? You just abandoned us? Packed up and left without a word? Do you even understand what you've done to this family?" My jaw clenched. "I did exactly what you asked me to do." "What are you talking about?" she spat, disbelief dripping from her words. I leaned back against the counter, letting the sunlight from the balcony wash over me. "You told me to disappear," I said slowly. "And so I did." Her laugh was sharp, humorless. "That was a fight, Grace. People say things when they're angry. You don't just throw away decades of family legacy because of a fight." I swallowed, feeling the words coil up inside me, bitter and sharp. "It wasn't just a fight, Amanda. It was years. Years of feeling unwelcome, of walking on eggshells, of not knowing where I fit in anymore. You said you didn't need my help, so I stopped giving it. You said I suffocated you, so I gave you space. You said you'd be better off without me, so I made it happen." Silence. I could hear her breathing, sharp and uneven. "You're being selfish," she hissed. "Maybe," I agreed, "but it's the first time I've been selfish in my whole life, and you know what? It feels pretty damn good." We agreed to meet at a cafe the next morning. I arrived early, the place still quiet, sunlight pooling on the polished wooden floors. I ordered tea and chose a seat by the window, watching the world pass by as I waited. They arrived together. Eric walked in first, his eyes scanning the room before they landed on me. His step faltered. I saw his gaze flicker over my new haircut. Shorter, softer, streaked with silver that I no longer bothered to hide. His eyes traveled to my clothes, brighter and more vibrant than I'd ever worn before. He stopped, just for a second, then straightened his shoulders and walked over, Amanda trailing behind him. "Mom," he said, his voice tight. "Eric, Amanda," I replied calmly, gesturing for them to sit. The tension was thick as they settled in, Amanda's eyes sharp and watchful. "You look different," Eric murmured. "I feel different," I replied simply. Amanda wasted no time. "I still can't believe you sold the house. That was supposed to be for the kids, for Eric and me when—" She trailed off, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I raised my cup, letting the steam warm my face. "That house was mine. I kept it for you because I thought it was what you wanted. But you made it clear you didn't want me around, so I moved on. And I set up college funds for the twins. They'll have more than enough when the time comes." Amanda's jaw clenched. "You abandoned your family for what? To sit by the beach and pretend you're 20 again?" I smiled gently, unfazed by her tone. "I didn't abandon anyone. I just stopped living my life for someone else's benefit. I've done my part. Now, it's time I live for me." Eric's expression softened just slightly, a flicker of understanding, or maybe regret, flashing across his features. "We didn't want this," he said quietly. We didn't mean it." I met his gaze, unblinking. "Well, it's done. And I'm happier than I've been in years." Amanda leaned back, crossing her arms. "So what now? You're just gone?" I shook my head. "No, I'll visit. I'll send postcards. I'll call. But my life is mine now, Amanda. And you'll have to learn to live with that." She didn't respond, her eyes fixed firmly on the tabletop. Eric, though, nodded slowly. "I guess we'll have to," he said, his voice soft. I sipped my tea, letting the warmth settle into my bones. For the first time in my life, I felt free. The scent of rosemary chicken drifted through my condo, mingling with the sea breeze that slipped in through the open balcony door. I set the dining table with care, the bright turquoise plates catching, the sunlight streaming in from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, waves lapped gently at the shore, children's laughter mingling with the distant call of seagulls. It had been months since I'd hosted a Sunday dinner, and this one felt entirely different. I moved through my kitchen with a lightness I hadn't known in years. The space was smaller than my Victorian, but it was mine. Every object, every painting, every flower vase, I had chosen it all. Maps of Paris, Rome, and Tokyo adorned the walls, and a stack of brochures for upcoming cruises lay neatly on the coffee table, evidence of plans I had never dreamed of making before. The knock on the door came promptly at 2. I brushed off my hands, smoothed my blouse, and opened it with a smile. Eric stood there, Amanda just behind him, holding the twins' hands. For a moment, the 4 of them stood still, blinking as if they'd just stepped into another world. "Wow," Eric breathed, eyes traveling across the living room. This is different." I stepped back, waving them inside. "Welcome," I said, warmly, and the twins bolted forward, giggling as they bounded into the open space. Their footsteps echoed off the hardwood floors, the brightness of the room seeming to energize them. "Grandma! Grandma! Look!" Ella squealed, pointing to the framed photo on my mantel. It was from Alaska, me bundled up in a red coat, the northern lights swirling brilliantly behind me. "Is this real?" I laughed, kneeling beside her. "It's very real. I took that on my trip up north. We watched the lights dance across the sky. It was magical." Tommy's eyes grew wide. "Did you see polar bears?" "Not on that trip," I chuckled. "But maybe on the next one." Amanda hovered near the door, her hands clasped tightly around her purse. Her eyes moved across the room, pausing on the colorful paintings, the maps pinned, up like windows to other worlds, the soft blues and greens that washed the walls. "It's very bright," she murmured. I smiled, unfazed. I've had enough muted tones for one lifetime. Dinner was lively. I had set the table with my new dinnerware, bright blues and yellows, patterns that reminded me of summers in Italy. Not that I'd been to Italy, not yet, but the brochure was on my coffee table, marked with sticky notes and circled with plans. The twins chattered nonstop, asking questions about my cruise, the dolphins I'd seen on morning walks, the pottery. I had started crafting at the community center. Amanda and Eric listened quietly, eating slowly, occasionally glancing at each other with expressions I couldn't quite place. When dessert came, an apple tart I'd learned to make from a cooking class at the community center, Eric finally spoke. "You seem different, Mom," he said, his fork hovering above his plate. I met his eyes and smiled. "I am different." His gaze dropped to his lap, and he nodded, his expression thoughtful. Amanda stared down at her plate, cutting her tart into perfect little squares, but she didn't argue. That was something. After dinner, the twins dragged me to the living room, begging for stories. I sat on the couch, their small bodies curled up on either side of me, eyes wide with excitement. "Did you really go on a boat?" Tommy asked, his voice a whisper. "I did," I replied, nodding. "A big one. We sailed right up next to the glaciers. Some were taller than buildings. And the water was so clear you could see the fish swimming underneath," Ella gasped. "Did you go swimming?" "It was much too cold for that," I laughed. "But I did see whales. They swam right beside the ship, flipping their tails up in the air like they were waving hello. Their eyes shone with wonder, and I felt something warm bloom in my chest, filling the spaces that had been empty for far too long. When it came time for them to leave, the twins clung to my waist, their faces buried in my sweater. "Can we come? Back, Grandma? Please?" I knelt down, brushing Tommy's hair from his eyes. "Of course you can, anytime you like." Amanda hovered by the door, watching the scene with her arms crossed. Her expression was still reserved, her mouth set in a thin line, but she gave me a nod. Small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Eric stood back, his hands tucked into his pockets, eyes scanning the condo one last time. Finally, as the twins ran back to him, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a tight embrace. I froze for a moment, then softened into it, patting his back gently. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he whispered, his voice thick. I didn't understand before, but I do now. My breath caught in my throat, and I squeezed him tighter. When we pulled apart, he looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw a flicker of the boy he used to be. The one who would run to me after school, desperate to tell me everything that happened. He took Amanda's hand, and together, they led the twins out the door. I stood there for a moment, watching them pile into the car, their laughter muffled by the glass. As they pulled away, I waved, my hand stilling in the air long after they were out of sight. I closed the door, the silence settling around me, but it didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. I walked back to the living room, picking up the cruise, brochures from the coffee table. I flipped through the pages, my eyes catching on the ones marked with sticky notes: Rome, Paris, the Greek Isles. I ran my fingers over the glossy images, and a smile spread across my face. They would be back. I knew that now. But when they did, I would still be me, whole, independent, unburdened. And I would be ready for them. Not because I had to be, but because I wanted to be. I leaned back against the cushions, the sound of the waves drifting through the open balcony door. I closed my eyes, breathing in the salt air, and for the first time in a long while, I knew I was exactly where I belonged.